This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream and my streaming service, Nebula. So in retrospect, November 8th, 1548 was a bit of a dark day in music history, because that was the day that Henry II, King of France, would grant an exclusive publication monopoly over all new books of music, as well as guitar, lute, and organ tablature, which is a thing, to a local publisher by the name of Nicolas du Chaumont. And in doing so, whether or not he realized it, Henry II, in that moment, by the authority vested in him by God and his sword, created music copyright. And we've been dealing with the ramifications of that ever since. Now, the modern trend of copyright infringement lawsuits that I've covered extensively here on this channel, as well as the upcoming AI music revolution, have revealed some problems with this 16th century intellectual property project that Henry II started, turning music from a communal cultural knowledge into private property which can be owned. Now, in this video, I'm not going to be justifying piracy or plagiarism or anything like that, nor will I touch NFTs, but I am very concerned with the financialization of musical ideas, turning musical compositions into financial assets which can be bought, sold, and traded, something that we have started to see where major artists sell their publishing rights, their musical compositions, to investment firms. And so with that, I ask the question, how do you own a musical idea? And by whose authority? God's? The sword of the kings? Or otherwise? Part 1. Rhythm-A-Ning. I don't consider myself a musician that has achieved perfection, but I compose my pieces with a formula that I created myself. Thelonious Monk. So I came across this great blog post by the jazz writer Fernando O Urbina that I think perfectly illustrates why it's difficult to figure out who owns a piece of music.
This one's called Rhythm-A-Ning.
This blog post is all about the history of Thelonious Monk's Rhythm-A-Ning, which is a jazz standard that's based off of another jazz standard, George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. See, it's very common for jazz musicians to take the existing harmonic structure of another piece of music and write a new melody on top of it, largely to get around copyright laws. The reason why you do this is because you want to improvise over chord changes that you know already. I've Got Rhythm is very popular. It's played in jazz jam sessions around the world and has been for 100 years. And so if you're writing a new piece of music, you can use the same vocabulary that you would be improvising with over I Got Rhythm on your new tune. These new tunes that people write are called contrafacts. And I Got Rhythm has more contrafacts than any of them. Like, you're probably familiar with the Flintstones theme, for example. The Flintstones theme is a contrafact of I Got Rhythm.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones.
The same harmonic structure, but there's a different melody. It's a different song. If you write a melody, if you write your own original melody, even if you are using the harmonic structure of another piece of music, in theory, you own this new piece of music, right? Well, Thelonious Monk's Rhythm-A-Ning is an example of maybe? Because the melody that he uses in his I Got Rhythm contrafact, an ascending major triad based on the root, followed by an ascending major triad based on the fourth degree, followed by a descending broken thirds scale line, actually has a long history as a piece of melodic vocabulary that goes with I Got Rhythm. Like, there's a history of this particular little riff being used as an improvisational device on top of the chord progression for I Got Rhythm. Now, the definitive version of Thelonious Monk's Rhythm-A-Ning came out in 1958, but in 1932, the trombone player Lawrence Brown played this particular riff on a recording of Duke Ellington's Ducky Wucky. Now, Lawrence Brown probably improvised this, but this is very likely a piece of common vocabulary among jazz musicians in the 1930s, because 2 years later, in 1934, Teddy Bunn plays it on I've Got the World on a String. Probably a little bit more famously, in 1936, the arranger and pianist Mary Lou Williams included this riff, writing for Andy Kirk's orchestra on Walking and Swingin'. This seems to be the first instance of where the riff was written down as part of the composed section of a piece of music and not just improvised. In the 1940s, at the legendary bebop club known as Minton's Playhouse, this particular riff was called Pagin' Dr. Christian, after the guitarist Charlie Christian. Charlie Christian was a regular at the jam sessions at Minton's Playhouse, where the house band was comprised by Kenny Clark on drums, Nick Fenton on bass, Joe Guy on trumpet, and a young Thelonious Monk on piano. Clearly, the riff was in the air in the 1940s. Monk heard it, Monk played it a bunch. There are many instances of the riff at the time. You have Artie Shaw and his orchestras, To a Broadway Rose. You have Count Basie's Taps Miller. You have Woody Herman's Dandelion. Then, of course, there's Opus Caprice by Al Haig. This version ended up being very popular. Multiple artists recorded it. Finally, in 1957, Thelonious Monk would record Rhythm-A-Ning for the first time, and a year later, in 1958, record the definitive version of his song. Clearly, Thelonious Monk was not the first person to have this idea. There was a long history of this idea, especially as it's applied to George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. To be fair to Monk, he was just writing a piece of music using this riff the same way that Mary Lou Williams had, and Woody Herman had, and all of these other musicians for the past 30 years. This is just a thing you did. You used this particular riff, and then you wrote a song with it. However, Rhythm-A-Ning is the most famous version by far of this particular musical idea. But he didn't write it himself. It is the most famous version, but he didn't write it. So the question is, who owns it? It's a harder question to answer than you might think.
There goes Blue. Blue's gonna do what we can too.
Part 2, property rights. The first person who, having enclosed a plot of land, took it into his head to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In the 17th century, the role of the state was to protect the interests of property holders.
That's its role today, too.
And so there needed to be a legal justification for property. Now, if you're a fan of the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, as I know many of my viewers are, look at him, what a stud, you'd say that property is based on work. Locke reasoned that the only thing that we can definitively say is our own body and what we do with it. Everything else is nature's. Whatsoever, then, he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with it and joined it to something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. So to make something your property, you gotta mix in your labor somehow. An apple in a tree, not yours. If you pick it, it is yours. For this labor, being the unquestionable property of the laborer, no man but he can have a right to what that it is joined to, at least where there is enough and as good left in common for others. Property was very important to 17th century Englishmen like John Locke because property represented political and social agency. Only landed property owners could participate in government. And intellectual property gives a similar kind of agency to the 21st century creative class because it gives value to artistic labor, letting people, live. Since data can be copied freely on the internet, musicians need some form of guarantee that their work will be compensated. We don't have the sword of Henry II by our side, but copyright is one solution here. It's not the only one. Patreon. But it does give some guarantee that the labor of musical composition will be rewarded. However, the US does not recognize labor as the source of intellectual property value. That is way too Marxist a proposition, a labor theory of value. Not in my United States, god damn it! In the 1991 case, Feist Publications versus Rural Telephone Service Company, the Supreme Court rejected the so-called sweat of the brow doctrine after Genesis chapter 3, verse 19. By the sweat of your brow, you will have food to eat until you return to the ground from which you are made. The US explicitly rejects sweat of the brow, this very Lockean understanding of property rights, when it comes to intellectual property. Instead, these rights are granted by originality and creativity. Now, it does make a degree of sense. That Feist case that we mentioned earlier was all about phone companies and phone books. It does take time, it does take labor to list phone numbers in a phone book, but that act doesn't show any creative expression, so why should copyright law apply? So we end up having two different philosophical underpinnings to the concept of property: sweat of the brow and originality. With this in mind, let's take a look again at Rhythm-A-Ning.
Rhythm-A-Ning.
Who owns this idea? Now, was it Lawrence Brown of Duke Ellington's band? He was the first person to play it, or at least the first person that we have record of. Is it Mary Lou Williams, who was the first person to write it down as part of a composition for a band to play? Or is it the canon Thelonious Monk? To me, this sounds like a natural evolution of the idea. Through every iteration, each artist brings something new and original. Even though it is the same idea, it's also different. But the legal system doesn't do a great job of acknowledging this practice of same and different. Instead, copyright law is a bit of a blunt tool. A New York Times article interviewed songwriters about the confusing state of music copyright in the wake of that infamous 2014 Blurred Lines case. The songwriter Evan Bogard recounts second-guessing himself in the studio. I shouldn't be thinking about legal precedent when I am trying to write a chorus.
I mean, there's the George Harrison quote where he says he's scared to touch the piano because he might be touching someone else's note, and there's definitely a feeling of that in the studio sometimes. Find yourself in the moment second-guessing yourself.
Who's good too? We can too.
Part 3, copyright. I am not a lawyer. Please take this with a grain of salt. Okay, here we go. There are two kinds of musical copyright. The first is the copyright that's associated with recordings. If you record something, even if it's a cover, you still own that recording and can profit off of it. I did not write Run Away With Me by Carly Rae Jepsen, but I do own the copyright to my specific recording of Run Away With Me by Carly Rae Jepsen. However, since I didn't write the song, she and her songwriters get a cut of the royalties, which are called mechanical royalties, for every sale and stream of this recording. That's because there is a second form of musical copyright, which is the form that we're talking about today, the copyright for the musical composition. Carly Rae Jepsen and her songwriters own the idea of Run Away With Me. This side of the copyright is the one that I have a little bit more of a problem with, for a number of reasons, but not the least of which is the fact that it's very difficult to define what a musical idea is and isn't. In Newton versus Diamond, courts noted that musical composition, the musical idea, consists of rhythm, harmony, and melody expressed in written form. This concept, baked into copyright law jurisprudence, is based on the Western European classical idea, specifically 19th century Romantic era idea, that written notation expresses the true intent behind an author's work. In that style, it does make a degree of sense, especially historically. Notation is the medium in which the author of the music works. They're literally writing stuff down on a piece of paper as they compose, or in more modern times, notation software. In more modern popular styles, though, the medium in which artists work is usually recorded sound itself. Often in recording studios or digital audio workstations, authors of musical ideas are often taking recordings and then manipulating them on musical timelines. For certain styles of music, you're just very rarely writing things in notation. That's just not how the music is communicated or conceived. But that's not how the copyright system is set up. To the extent those compositional elements are elaborated within the score, the sounds that would necessarily result from anybody's performance of them are protected. It's set up as if recordings and compositions were entirely separate entities. This has led to some interesting cases where the judge has instructed a jury to not listen to the recordings of songs in question in copyright infringement suits because it might influence their decisions about copyright infringement. I mean, yeah. Instead, the probably musically illiterate jury is expected to parse the finer aspects of musical notation. Musical notation which was likely transcribed by another party besides the artist from the recording. Schenkerian analysis has been deployed in court before, a highly technical approach to the harmonic aesthetic of 18th and 19th century European music that often requires a graduate degree in music theory to even begin to understand. But it does look impressive, so, I mean, yeah. Why not? This reliance on a symbolic representation of musical ideas through written notation is reflective of a much earlier generation of legal and musical thought. The judge that's bringing back the Marvin Gaye Ed Sheeran case to court is 95 years old. He started practicing law in 1955 before the rise of Elvis Presley, before my father was born, and so likely has that generation's understanding of musical creation. You might say that I find some problems with this conception of musical composition. First, hip-hop, and many styles of modern electronic music, is based upon the manipulation of sounds and samples, where the salient musical aspects of the composition are not easily written down and are in fact largely lost when trying to translate to Western musical notation. I just don't see how you would write down in notation something like this without losing the thing that makes it cool and unique. Like Schenkerian analysis? I mean, come on. Second, when you coldly reduce musical expression to just rhythms, melodies, and harmonies which can be notated, it's hard to show originality, that pillar of intellectual property law in the United States. Let me show you just how hard it is. Part 4, musical constraints. The thing that hath been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9.
There's only so many notes and very few chords used in pop music. Coincidence is bound to happen, and there's only 12 notes that are available.
Okay, so yeah, there are only 12 notes, at least as represented on the piano, anyway. Yes, I know there's more than that, chill. But even within that, in the Western system, we gravitate towards a subset of 7 of them called the major scale. Within the major scale, there are certain melodic tendencies that are pretty damn strong because of acoustic as well as culturally enforced reasons. Melodies tend to end on the first note of the scale. That's the root, because it's heavily represented in the harmonic series. Same thing with the 5th note of the scale. It too is represented in the harmonic series, and melodies that want to feel rested will gravitate to either the root or the 5th. The 4th note of the scale, especially historically, wants to resolve down to the 3rd note of the scale. Same thing with the 6th note of the scale wanting to resolve down to the 5th note. In classical music, the 7th note of the scale wants to resolve up to the root, an octave higher. And maybe in jazz music, the 7th note of the scale wants to resolve down to the 6th. Different emotions are created by different melodic leaps. Power. Yearning. Resignment. The point here is that these tendencies are baked into the melodic styles that songwriters are working in and that audiences expect. A lot of these decisions are kind of already made for you before you start writing any music. It goes deeper though, because there are only 6 diatonic chords which are used with any degree of frequency, and the overwhelming harmonic paradigm for most popular song is repetitive 4-chord chord loops. Once you choose your 4-chord chord loop, of which there are only several which are used with any degree of frequency, the chord tones will influence melodic decisions. For example, the note C on a C chord sounds rested. The note C on a G chord sounds rather restless. And so if you have a common chord loop that people like the sound of, that people expect, that people want to hear, there are only so many melodic choices that you have available to you. These chord tones are influencing your melodic decisions. And this influence goes deep. Andrew Huang notes that the supertonic, the 2nd degree of the scale, has become very popular to emphasize in pop music because
it's on average the least offensive note. It sounds perfectly good over any chord in the scale.
Constraints of the human voice usually limit melodies to a relatively small range, especially if you're writing pop music, which encourages non-singers to sing along. While there are an enormous number of possible permutations of the musical notes of the scale, only a few are pleasing, and much fewer still suit the infantile demands of the popular ear. That was said in 1940, by the way. Brutal. Song structures are deeply formalized as well. It's rare for a pop song to not use a verse-chorus format. It's rare for jazz not to use head-in, solo, head-out. It's rare for prog songs not to use an incomprehensible mess of time signatures. I'm looking at you, Dream Theater. Looking at you. And in many styles of music, rhythm is very formulaic. For example, 4/4, 4 beats to the measure, is overwhelmingly the most common meter in Western pop music. It is the default setting on most digital audio workstations. You'll hear other time signatures like 9/8 in pop music that's not from the West, but if you're writing music for audiences that dance in 4/4, you're gonna write in 4/4. Musical instruments might have specific physical idiomatic constraints that would funnel people towards the same creative choices. There are so many songs based around chord progressions using the open chords of a guitar because they're easy to play on guitar. Like if we think about that Marvin Gaye Ed Sheeran lawsuit that has been going on for years now. I think I covered it like 4 years ago. Wow. Ed Sheeran was sued because his song Thinking Out Loud sounded too similar to Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On.
Let's get it on, sugar. Baby, my heart could still fall less hard at 23.
And that's because the chord progressions are more or less the same, but the chord progression that we're talking about is one that's very easy to play on guitar. Like it matches the physicality of the instrument, which is probably why the Beach Boys used a similar progression in 1966.
This is the way I always dreamed it would be.
Same chords as Let's Get It On. Like so much of the harmonic vocabulary of pop music is based on the physicality of this instrument, what feels good to play. So honestly, who cares if Ed Sheeran stole from Marvin Gaye, because Marvin Gaye was working from the same rubric that Ed was. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. A lot of Bible references in this video. It's a good Christian video. With all of these constraints, it is a statistical certainty that songs are going to start sounding similar to one another, especially considering that there are over 100,000 songs being uploaded to Spotify every day. For many styles of music, I just don't see how you would show originality, this pillar of intellectual property law in the United States, through things that are easily expressed in musical notation. So many of the creative decisions that songwriters make are almost Calvinistically predetermined by factors beyond their control. This, by the way, is a feature, not a bug in music. It's good that there is an underlying blueprint to so many compositions, because it's a way of connecting your past experiences of music to new music. It's a way of connecting your experiences to another person's. But it's sometimes difficult to see this underlying blueprint because music is so abstract. Even if you are a songwriter yourself, you might not realize that there is this blueprint underneath everything. And so with that, we have to talk about the idea-expression divide. What is the difference between an idea and the expression of it? Part 5, in which Adam inexplicably starts talking about sandwiches for a while and also somehow manages to not mention Plato. Yeah, it will make sense in a second. So I'm gonna go out here on a limb and make an assumption about you. Chances are you eat food. Bold of me to assume, but here's another one. Chances are you eat food every day. More than that, you probably make food quite frequently as well. You do this probably as a matter of mortal necessity. You have a deep understanding of what goes into making and eating food. So you probably have a decent understanding of what goes into making a sandwich. You throw together some ingredients, you get the bread, whatever, you throw something together. The end result is unique to you. You gathered the ingredients, you put it together, but the general idea behind the sandwich isn't yours. You didn't invent the idea of a sandwich. It is, in fact, a shared cultural knowledge. You didn't invent the idea of a sandwich, but it was your idea to make it, you made it your way, and you get to decide how to eat it. This is the so-called idea-expression divide. Only expressions of an idea can be owned, which is why most recipes can't in fact be copyrighted. The expression of the idea is your labor, you actually going and making the sandwich. We can trace the idea of the sandwich back to one person, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, or at least allegedly, but the sandwiches are not collecting royalties on their namesake anytime anybody makes one. Nobody is getting sued if they decided to make themselves a sandwich or decided to sell sandwiches to other people. Thank God nobody is collecting royalties on the idea of a sandwich. Music's a little bit different. You see, most people only have a good idea of music consumption. They have a daily, intimate relationship with listening to music, but not making it, which is different from our relationship to food, where we have a concept of food consumption and food production. Because there is only a select class of people doing the music production, among the general public, there isn't an intuitive understanding of how the idea becomes the expression. There is a mysticism behind music production, a mysticism which doesn't exist with food production. In court, questions of music ownership are not answered by those who make music, musicians. Instead, those questions are handed over to a consumer class, juries of non-musicians. This practice is actually an important part of the legal doctrine in the US, going back to 1946. A jury of lay listeners, rather than judges informed by expert opinion, will be the ones who ultimately decide these copyright infringement cases. The law is ultimately put into the consumer's hands, which unfortunately is just ever so ripe for exploitation. Imagine a sandwich copyright case, where a jury is brought 2 ham sandwiches and asked if they taste similar to one another. It's basically what's happening in music copyright cases. Juries are asked if Ed Sheeran's ham sandwich tastes different enough from Marvin Gaye's ham sandwich. Juries are then led to believe that Marvin Gaye invented the idea of the ham sandwich, where he very clearly did not. He just used the same ingredients that other chefs had used before in the past making ham sandwiches. There are only so many ways to make a ham sandwich. And if you don't appeal to the tastes of people who want to eat ham sandwiches, your ham sandwich will suck. You gotta know how ham sandwiches taste. There's only so many ingredients that will make sense in a ham sandwich. And so if some flaming asshole like David Pullman of Structured Asset Sales buys the recipe to Marvin Gaye's ham sandwich, they now have the legal means, defended by the sword of the king, to say that they own the idea of a ham sandwich.
I look forward to more success in this case, which involves the largest copyright infringement in history.
I'm sure you are. What kind of dystopian nightmare are we inviting when investment firms can now own the concepts behind food? This thing that nourishes us every day, this thing that is with us at every important moment in our lives, this thing that we cannot go without. Yeah, okay, famous ham sandwich chefs are getting paid, but at what cost to the rest of us? They're just giving greedy parasites a means of rent-seeking basic human behavior, the production of food. What were we talking about again?
Their third number, they play one of my special favorites amongst compositions. This one's called Rhythm-A-Ning.
Part 6, solving copyright. Maybe. So through my YouTube videos or through my music, I feel like as an artist, my work is an extension of my voice. It represents a deep, deep part of me and how I relate to the world around me. And so I think the sting of plagiarism comes from hearing somebody else speak with your voice. Kirby Ferguson in Everything is a Remix argues that this feeling stems from loss aversion.
We believe that ideas are property, and we're excessively territorial when we feel that property belongs to us.
I agree with this, but I also want to add the added caveat of power imbalance. Larger artists will often plagiarize smaller artists and not compensate them for the work that they have done. And there's also the long history of white artists appropriating black culture, sanitizing it for a white audience, and profiting off of it. There are no easy answers here, and I don't have a solution, but I do have a suggestion that at least addresses the plagiarism thing when it comes to copyright infringement. I think that music composition copyright should be replaced by a citational system of sorts, where if you write something, or if you write a piece of music, you gotta cite your sources. After that, you can do whatever you want with it. Think about this. When you go to school and you write a paper, you're expected to 1, research, and 2, cite where you got your ideas from. The process of citation is at the core of academic research. In order to build on a general body of knowledge, you need to know what came before. As a researcher, you're expected to connect your work to the past. In fact, if you don't cite previous work, you're not a serious researcher. You don't know what you're doing. And so, what if musicians and artists were compelled to do likewise, as a matter of social and legal responsibility? This completely flips the script on everything to do with copyright law, because now plagiarism is avoided by simply citing other people. People no longer will get territorial with ideas because to be cited by another person adds to both people's prestige. Now, I have no idea how any of this would work in practice. maybe a percentage of your publishing rights would go into a communal pool, and then it would be your responsibility to cite your musical lineage, the same way that it is for an academic to cite theirs. And if you don't do that, maybe one of the professional organizations like ASCAP or BMI could take on that role. And there has been an ad hoc citation system of sorts that's popped up in the wake of the modern copyright cases. It's common for artists to be preemptively added to a songwriters list just to prevent any future lawsuits. If we adopted a citational system where it's expected as a musician that you cite your sources, this reflects musical practice in a real way. In jazz music, it's not only okay, but actively encouraged to incorporate others' ideas into your own work. Quoting is important. It means that you have engaged with the communal cultural knowledge that is music, and you are doing your part to carry it on in your own way. In this way, music as a body of knowledge can continue in an iterative fashion without having to worry about copyright and the legal system preventing this particular form of expression. And so really, you know, the answer to that question, who owns this riff, is, well, everyone. I've been watching TikTok producers, as one does, and there is something so awesome about the gleeful disregard of music copyright sometimes. Like this wild mashup of the GameCube theme, the Donkey Kong rap, and Lil Jon. This would be an absolute nightmare if you ever tried to clear these licenses.
Nintendo will probably sue me over this.
It's because the US copyright system gives rights holders control of derivative works, which brings up the point that all of this is ultimately moot because it comes down to just, can you afford to sue, yes or no? And that's ultimately what it's about, right? Music copyright, this thing that in theory protects artists, or at least that's what we're told, instead is used as a mechanism for rent seeking. People trying to make money without actually contributing anything to the culture or to the art. Speaking of contributing things to culture and art, Nebula is the creator-owned streaming service that features many of your favorite YouTube educational creators. It's kind of like YouTube, but it's just for the stuff that you actually want to watch. There's all kinds of great bonus content on there that you can't find anywhere else, like Lindsay Ellis's triumphant return to video essays. Like, seriously, if you enjoyed this longer form video essay kind of video, you're gonna really enjoy this stuff over on Nebula. It's a great place to watch and discover quality content ad-free, as well as support your favorite creators. Now, Nebula, and this video, is sponsored by another fantastic streaming service, Curiosity Stream. If you've ever wondered what happened to great educational television like History Channel or Discovery Channel, it's over there on Curiosity Stream, the go-to source for the very best documentaries on the internet with thousands of titles to choose from, including Can a Computer Write a Hit Musical? A very fun look into expressing the idea that a computer might have. How's that for some copyright shenanigans? If you're interested in either Nebula or Curiosity Stream, you can click the link in the description or go to curiositystream.com/Adam Neely. And when you do so, you can sign up for both Nebula and Curiosity Stream for just $14.79 a year. By clicking the link in the description or by clicking the link that's on the screen right now, you're not only supporting this channel, but all of the creators over on Nebula as we create content that aims to engage the world in a more meaningful way. Thank you everybody for watching.
Peace.